So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about two very major thinkers in 20th century political economy. I'll be talking about the ideas of John Maynard Keynes and F.A. Hayek. Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you all about their ideas, so I'll truncate it in terms of kind of two contrasting stories. But I want to preface it by saying I'm not here to tell you about old ideas for old ideas' sake, okay? I am telling you about these ideas from two of these, towering figures in 20th century political economy, precisely because I think these old ideas can bear new fruit. These ideas have lasting significance for the way in which we think about frames of viewing the world. And they also kind of sow the seeds for some kind of new ideas and new ways of approaching challenges that haven't been dealt with yet. So not old ideas for old ideas' sake, but to bear new ideas and new fruit. Okay, just a quick overview. John Maynard Keynes was born in 1883. He was the son of another economist, John Neville Keynes. He was educated at Cambridge, but during his time at Cambridge, he actually only took one economics course while he was there. He took that course from Alfred Marshall, a very famous economist as well. But Keynes was much more interested in kind of the practical application of ideas. He was much more interested in kind of getting his hands dirty in terms of the actual policy making. And so, as a very young economist and budding intellectual, he had the opportunity to become a UK advisor to the Treaty of Versailles after World War II, in the post-World War II period. And he was a delegate of the Treasury. I'm going to talk more about his experience there. But afterwards, he came back and reflected on that experience and wrote a very influential tract called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And again, I'll say more about that in just a minute. But that really kind of burst him onto the scene. And so Keynes is widely regarded as having this kind of towering intellect of being an incredibly persuasive, incredibly charismatic individual that was able to really be persuasive in areas of public policy because of the way he presented his ideas and the ideas that he held. Keynes had done his earlier work on kind of technical monetary theory. He published a tract on monetary reform before kind of revising these ideas and updating them into his treatise on money. And his treatise on money was a 2-volume treatise. It was incredibly important in kind of building out some of his ideas about the business cycle. But it was this kind of tract that F.A. Hayek would come to respond to in his technical understandings of the business cycle. And so Hayek reviewed this book. He reviewed it very critically and kind of bringing his own ideas to the table. And it was in light of this work that Keynes kind of revised his ideas and published the general theory of employment, interest, and money, which he became quite famous for. And this really contained all of the seeds of what comes to be the core of Keynesian economics. So it's kind of advancing this idea that the macroeconomy is governed mainly by aggregate demand, that when we think about kind of macroeconomic stabilization policies, we should be kind of turning our attention to fiscal policy and monetary policy as well. But it really took a turn to overturning or attempting to overturn kind of a classical theory about how it is that markets provide a means for harmonizing individual and social interest. And so this is something I'll talk about in just a minute. To give an overview of Hayek, Hayek was an Austrian economist. He was born right at the turn of the century, and he lives quite longer than Keynes. I won't speculate as to why that is. But he starts off his education at the University of Vienna, and he's part of what comes to be called like these Viennese circles. Okay? Vienna was a very intellectually diverse and interesting place at the time. You had the philosophers that were talking to the economists, that were talking to mathematicians, that were talking to psychologists and sociologists. And so it was a very interesting and intellectual climate for Hayek to be in. And so he comes to work with his probably the most influential economist on Hayek's earlier thought, Ludwig von Mises. And he works with Mises in what comes to be the Business Cycle Research Institute in Vienna. And it's here that Hayek's going to take some very critical ideas from Mises. It's also here he's going to develop his own technical understandings of monetary theory. And so Hayek spent some time in working in the Business Cycle Research Center before he becomes recruited to the LSE, where he kind of, again, becomes this kind of superstar young economist. Lionel Robbins recruits him there to the LSE, and it's there where he's really going to develop many of his key kind of contributions to technical monetary and capital theory. But he's also going to refine his arguments about markets as discovery procedures and the role of prices in generating entrepreneurial activity, about the role of prices in directing the economy. And that's going to play such a role in some of the contributions that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. He publishes some earlier works on capital theory and the business cycle. Prices and production is quite important, and kind of tries to develop that idea further in the pure theory of capital. But Hayek's also involved in some of these grander debates, and this is what I'll talk about in just a second. He publishes some work against collectivist economic planning. These are ideas that he kind of develops initially with Ludwig Mises and then brings these ideas to the LSE, where he starts to become engaged in some arguments with market socialists and market people who want to try to advance the notion of comprehensive economic planning, but using the tools of kind of technical economics. So after that, he publishes The Road to Serfdom, and this is basically what I'll talk about in just a second. In terms of taking these ideas from the realm of technical economics and translating them and making them applicable to kind of a wider audience. And so in the process of kind of developing these arguments, Hayek comes to make what I'll point to as, I think, one of his most deepest contributions, his paper in 1945, The Use of Knowledge in Society. After 1945, he founds the Mont Pelerin Society. I'll basically end my story on that. But after founding the Mont Pelerin Society, and when he moves to the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago, he turns his attention to kind of not just doing technical economics and the role of prices in directing and coordinating market activity, but turning his attention to what are the framework for the rules in which these types of, what is the framework of the type of rules that are going to lead to markets being able to provide this coordinating function and having prices actually operate in such a way to try to bring about a liberal order. So this is a brief overview of the two. I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of detail in context in terms of two stories about each of these characters. Okay. So the first thing to point out is that these two thinkers, brilliant in their own respects, very much viewed the social world in different ways. In particular, Keynes viewed the world from a very constructivist, kind of top-down approach. He viewed the world from kind of a top-down view of social order, whereas Hayek consistently and persistently throughout his writings tried to emphasize how it is that rules can create the conditions under which you can have a spontaneous order emerge. So from Hayek's perspective, he's constantly looking at what are the kind of rules necessary in order to get a bottom-up activity to flourish. And these two different worldviews had very profound consequences, both for these scholars' own understanding of the world, but also for their prescriptions for how to advance a broadly liberal society. So briefly, Hayek drew on the traditions of the 18th and 19th century Scottish Enlightenment ideas. He very much kind of embodied and took forward a lot of their liberal principles. And this often led critics of Hayek to dismiss him of a man of the past, of someone who was kind of, thinking too much about old ideas. But it was through the lens of kind of the Scottish Enlightenment that Hayek often defended markets against the kind of champions of central planning, and also kind of brought forward this notion both of spontaneous order, but also a deep appreciation for how it is that sometimes seemingly irrational customs or traditions or institutions often are not irrational, but in fact embody hard-won knowledge of experience, okay, and actually embed that knowledge into these customs and rules. And so this was an idea that was central to Hayek's thought, whereas Keynes, on the other hand, very much fancied himself a cosmopolitan liberal. He started off at the beginning of the 20th century very much viewing himself as a liberal. But gradually, as I'll talk about in this story in just a second, his ideas came to coalesce around the desirability of central economic planning, and along with a lot of other views. He had some unsavory views about eugenics and population control, but it very much moved him into a position squarely in kind of a progressive left. And part and parcel of that came with an overabundance of faith in the power of rationalism, particularly as it was expressed in kind of elite opinions. So I'll start off with just saying a little bit, and my stories of these two characters are going to focus mostly on the first half of the 20th century, okay? But I'll be happy to kind of say some things about how these ideas had persisting influence. So at the beginning of, right before World War I, Keynes, famously extolled the virtues of globalization. This is a wonderful quote by Keynes. He says, "Look, the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could invest his wealth in various different adventures across the globe. He could travel freely without a passport, okay? He could secure cheap and affordable means of transit throughout the country." So Keynes is talking about the world, the globalized world that he lived in prior to World War I. And he exclaims, what an extraordinary episode just came to an end with the onset of the war. And so what Keynes is looking at is there was this first wave of globalization, and he was a proponent of that globalization. This is just a crude measure to kind of have a look at it. This is global exports as a share of total global GDP. This is one measure by which we might think about global economic integration. And what I want you to see from this graph is that by World War I, okay, the world had experienced a level of global economic integration that it hadn't prior to then, and that came collapsing down. Okay? So Keynes is looking at this world and he's lamenting the loss of this global economic integration. And so it's with this in mind that he goes to the Paris Peace Treaty. He is the representative for the UK Treasury, and he wants to try to analyze the dynamics of what happened during the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, he's highly critical of what happens in terms of, the punitive reparations that the Allied powers are going to ask of Germany. And so Keynes thinks it's tragic that we kind of barreled into World War I, but he thinks it's equally tragic that they failed to kind of make any kind of concerted effort to restore what he thought was the international order. Okay, so he becomes incredibly critical of the ways in which the Allied powers approach this issue. This is a beautiful quote. I won't read too many quotes from Keynes, but I have to kind of seize my opportunity to do it when it's really good. He says, "Look, moved by insane delusion and reckless self-regard, the German people overturned the foundations on which we all lived and built. But the spokesmen of the French and the British people have run the risk of completing the ruin by a peace which must impair yet further when it might have restored the delicate, complicated organization already shaken and broken by the war." Okay, so he's incredibly critical. Okay, he argues that the Paris Peace Treaty brought this disastrous peace treaty precisely because the key individuals involved had the wrong ideas about international political and economic relations, and they weren't kind of playing out the ways, the strategic interaction that Keynes thought was the way to go forward. So the experience of what Keynes saw as incompetence among world leaders would come to shape his view that if the right people are in place with the right ideas, then state planning could actually improve and outperform many kind of decentralized processes. And I'll compare this actually with Hayek's teacher, Ludwig von Mises, who wrote a very similar book at a very similar time, also critical of the Paris Peace Treaty, but from a wholly different perspective. So according to Keynes, the two rival impulses at the Paris Peace Conference were Clemenceau and Wilson. Okay? And Clemenceau sought to roll back Germany to its pre-1870 state, weaken it tremendously, whereas Woodrow Wilson had come into the negotiations with an overly ambitious, according to Keynes, and naive approach to constructing a whole new world order. And so Clemenceau carried the day, but this was perplexing. It was particularly perplexing to Keynes because Wilson enjoyed unprecedented hard and soft power in these negotiations. Okay? So Wilson, according to Keynes, the big shortfall in his respect was that he brought no concrete plan. He had no certain ideas about how to actually accomplish his goals. And so again, last quote that I'll read from Keynes, he's really harsh here. He says, "The president was not a hero or a prophet. He was not even a philosopher." Oh, okay? But a generously intentioned man with many of the weaknesses of other human beings and lacking the domineering intellectual equipment which would have been necessary to cope with the subtle and dangerous spellbinders whom a tremendous clash of forces and personalities had brought to the top as triumphant masters in a swift game of give and take. Okay, so Keynes just says, look, he wasn't prepared, he didn't have a detailed plan, and quite frankly, he wasn't smart enough in order to execute it. Okay, so his scathing critique focused on the individuals at the table and the particular ideas at play. And the lesson that Keynes took from this is that you needed someone who had the intellectual equipment, was prepared, and had a technocratic approach to dealing with these types of solutions. And so this view, this kind of experience that Keynes took from the Treaty of Versailles came to kind of inform his view of policymaking and the role that elites can play in kind of shaping and directing the course of future events. And so this idea about the need for the right planners in place also came together with Keynes's view about the fundamental brokenness of markets and market discipline. So in another tract that he wrote slightly earlier in the end of Laissez-faire, he basically comes out and attacks the fundamental classical political economy view that saw markets as a coordinating force. Okay, saw how it is that prices were able to coordinate the decisions of buyers and sellers in a market in such a way to often bring about a harmony of interest between private interest and social interest. And Keynes rejects this view. I won't read the entire quote, you can do it yourself. But he very much sees this as not the way that markets work, and in fact that, as the end of the quote states, individuals are often acting separately to promote their own ends and are too ignorant and too weak to even attain these. Okay, so these ideas kind of come together for Keynes, and when he comes to write his general theory of employment, interest, and money, it's very much from this perspective that markets don't function in any kind of way in which the classical political economists articulated that they do. They don't have a natural correcting force. And in fact, we're in need of technical elites to be able to guide and stabilize macroeconomic forces in the events of disastrous downturns such as the Great Depression. And so in the 1930s, even political moderates began advocating for all kinds of nationalizations, for all kinds of price controls. And after World War II, central planning began to be kind of the currency of the day. For Keynes, many of these ideas also came into close contact with the Fabian socialists at the time. This was part of the group that he was a part of. These were part of the milieu. And these ideas were gaining a lot of traction, particularly because they offered kind of a scientific approach to addressing many of the challenges that we're facing the post-Great Depression world. And so here we have pictured Beatrice and Sidney Webb. These were two very prominent Fabian socialists of the time. They were also influential in founding the London School of Economics. And Keynes's ideas married very well with this new notion of scientific socialism. Okay. So the Webbs had visited the Soviet Union in 1932. They came back and they were enamored by what they saw. They wrote a very large tract called Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, ? Where they praised the health and educational systems. They praised kind of a newfound system of equality. And they predicted that this would lead to a global spread of the social and economic systems of planned production that would substitute production for consumption, so basically substitute for production for direct consumption. Okay, so they were predicting kind of this rise and rollout of scientific socialism. And they were so confident in this that this was the wave of the future, in fact, that in the second edition of Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, they actually dropped the question mark. It was no longer a question. Okay, this was the wave of the future. Keynes was very taken by a lot of these ideas. Okay, he says the result is impressive. The Russian innovators are engaged in a vast administrative task of making a completely new set of social and economic institutions work smoothly and successfully. Meanwhile, the Webbs have enabled us to see the direction in which things appear to be moving and how far they've got. It's enthralling work. Okay, so there's a marriage between the ideas that Keynes was developing and the ways in which he saw kind of the advancement of central economic planning going. And so when, at the end of World War II, Labor has a landslide victory in the United Kingdom, and with it brings a whole set of policies designed to bring wartime planning that was very successful in World War II into the non-war economy. And so the idea was to ensure that there would be kind of a system of fair shares and that planning and direction from above would continue after the war in a way that was designed to continue to implement price controls, rationing of consumer goods, and these types of things. And they did. And so starting with around 1946, the UK experienced an entire wave of nationalization of whole areas of various different industries, including transportation, coal, electric, steel. And price controls and rationing continued for quite some time. So clothing and furniture were even rationed until 1948 and 1949. Food rationing continued until 1954. Coal rationing continued until 1958. And so these were very, very, pervasive ways of top-down planning in the UK. Now, I mention this now to turn to the alternative story, the kind of competing narrative of F.A. Hayek. And I turn to it now because it's important to recognize really what the UK economy looked like when Hayek comes to write The Road to Serfdom, which we'll get to in just a second. So the alternative kind of story of this other thinker in the 20th century is Hayek. And Hayek, as I mentioned, he was an Austrian economist. He was very much influenced by Ludwig von Mises. And Ludwig von Mises is a very interesting character in and of himself. We can talk about him in discussion sessions if you like. But Ludwig von Mises was very much a liberal in his own right. And in 1919, right after the Treaty of Versailles, he also writes a book where Keynes wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Ludwig von Mises wrote Nation, State, and Economy. And both of these books were a diagnosis of and prescription for that post-war situation. But Mises's take was very different. I'll emphasize first some similarities. Both authors recognized that each country's prosperity actually supports rather than undercuts the others. So Keynes was quite aware that trade was good for both countries and can actually help to bolster the economies of both. And both had an appreciation about how much the standard of living in Europe, and particularly of Germany, had depended on world trade. And so they also had both diagnosed the fact that the German ruling class and segments of public opinion had largely been responsible for the war, but they also recognized that overly punitive reparations would not necessarily be the solution in order to repair Europe moving forward. And so Mises's prescription of what he offers is quite different. And it's important to kind of set out this very different vision of liberalism, because Mises argues that, like Keynes, the punitive terms are not necessarily the recipe for success going forward, but instead of the order that Keynes puts forward, Mises suggests a much more radical vision of laissez-faire combined with a commitment of self-determination that would lead to kind of a breakup of old imperial structures. So the other debate that Mises is involved in at this time, okay, thanks. The other debate that Mises is involved in at this time is the socialist calculation debate. Okay, he is experiencing, thanks. He has witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution take place, and the Bolshevik Revolution, unlike the Marxist predictions that it would come from the proletariat and be this bottom-up revolution in which the proletariat, comes to bring forth the communist revolution. Instead, what you had is Lenin leading a revolution not of the proletariat, but of an elite that called themselves the vanguard of the proletariat. And so it's against this backdrop that Mises was arguing with many of the kind of contemporary Marxists at the time. And what the Marxists were arguing here was that when you change the nature of the institutional structure, when you had the revolution come and you had the implementation of communal property rights in the means of production, that you would actually overcome and change human beings. That socialist man would not be capitalist man because socialist man lived in a different institutional structure. Okay, so the incentives that motivate capitalist man wouldn't operate under communism, and that man would have higher ideals that would motivate them to produce for the common good. So Mises takes up this claim, and this becomes quite influential on Hayek's thought. Mises basically suggests that this is incredibly problematic. He wants to take on the argument about how it is that economic calculation might actually work under common ownership of the means of production. And he wants to take it on the terms that Marxists will agree with. So he says, look, I grant you the incentive argument. Let's suggest, okay, that socialist man will be motivated by higher ideals. But given that that's the case, how is it that socialist man is going to be able to make rational economic calculations about scarce resources? Okay, so this is the challenge that Mises develops in this argument, the economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. And I just have to point out how early this is. This is 1920 he's making this argument. And he's saying, look, if you have common ownership in the means of production, you're going to have to do without economic calculation. Okay? So what is his argument? Very briefly, he says, look, if you need private property rights in the means of production. Okay? If you don't have private property rights in the means of production, you're not going to generate appropriate incentives, okay, to engage in meaningful exchange. Okay? I need property rights to define mine and thine so that we can exchange and discover which is a better use for me and you of particular resources. So you need private property rights in the means of production to generate incentives to engage in real trade. And real trade generates real market prices. What do I mean by real market prices? Prices that actually reflect the real resource constraints on the ground and how it is that we view the relative prices of using goods in their various competing uses. Okay, so you need private property rights in the means of production to generate the incentives to trade, and to trade that generates meaningful market prices. So under the Soviet system, you would have prices for all kinds of things, but those prices were made up prices. They weren't prices that actually represented the real resource constraints on the ground. So Mises says you need private property rights to generate the incentives to generate exchanges that generate market prices that are meaningful. And those prices are meaningful because they transmit information about relative scarcities throughout the system. And it's through this transmission of information about relative scarcities that people are able to engage in profit and loss. And profit and loss is a mechanism by which we get feedback into the system about whether or not resources are flowing to their most highly valued uses. Okay? When entrepreneurs are making a profit, it's sending signals throughout the system that they're using resources in a way in which generates returns over and above the costs of the use of those resources. Okay? So Mises's argument is that it's the profit and loss mechanism that generates the conditions under which we know how to innovate, in which directions to innovate, and how we might go forward. So his argument in the socialist calculation debate was to suggest that if you don't have private property rights in the means of production, you're not going to have meaningful incentives to exchange. So the prices that you do have aren't going to actually reflect real resource constraints. So there's not going to be any information that's flowing through the system to tell people how to use resources well and in what ways. And so without that mechanism of profit and loss, you're basically going to be in the dark. And there's not going to be any kind of direction for innovation, growth, and change. And this argument about economic calculation under common ownership of the means of production becomes incredibly important and influential to Hayek. And so Hayek takes these arguments. Mises had been making these arguments in the German language community. And Hayek takes these arguments in the 1930s and he brings them with him to the LSE. And when he goes to the LSE and he takes these arguments forward, he confronts a whole other set of debate partners, of people who are engaged in these discussions. And in fact, they're his students. Okay? So Hayek thinks he's got, these hardcore arguments about why it is that economic calculation under common ownership of the means of production is not going to work. And of course, he's got two feisty students who are ready to debate him and tell him, no, we can make central economic planning work if only we use the tools of microeconomics. And so it's in the 1930s that Hayek begins to wrestle with these ideas, and it's the pushback from his students, in particular Abel Lerner and Oskar Lange, that present him with the opportunity to refine his ideas and to develop these ideas further. So the first kind of attempt that Hayek makes at kind of articulating this point more fully is a paper called Economics and Knowledge. And he begins to articulate what it is about the price system that accomplishes what central economic direction of resources cannot. And so in this paper, he makes a lot of important points, but he wants to focus on how it is that economics is about how knowledge is communicated and acquired. He wants to make the case that the price system is very much a system of communication, and that economics is fundamentally about expectations. So what does he mean by that? He says, look, in this article, he's making the case for prices as really acting as a guide to future behavior. Okay? As one of my other GMU professors likes to say, prices are a signal that are wrapped up as an incentive. So what what Hayek's pointing to here is that how it is that when prices move in particular directions, so when a price goes up, it sends a signal to people that that resource is scarce. Okay, so it's a signal that indicates that there's scarcity in that particular good, but it also sends an incentive, and that incentive goes to two parties. It incentivizes consumers to consume less of that good, but it also incentivizes producers to produce more of it. Okay, and so what Hayek's trying to develop in this economics and knowledge argument is about how it is that prices provide this future guide towards behavior, both on both sides of the market, both for producers and for consumers. And that we can't really actually understand the role that prices play in markets without understanding that they're fundamentally about expectations. Okay, so what Hayek's kind of getting at here is about how it is that prices provide this guide for future decision making. So he's going to take this argument and try to develop it even further and outline a vision of an economic system that's based not only on division of labor, an idea that goes all the way back to Adam Smith, but also on a division of knowledge. Okay? That one of the fundamental features that central economic planning can't overcome is the coordinating of knowledge that market prices achieve. Okay? So market economies take advantage of this division of knowledge by mobilizing knowledge that's essentially held in a decentralized fashion. Okay? So Hayek makes the point that data is subjective and actually oftentimes held in individual minds. So the knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place that entrepreneurs are able to act on is not the type of knowledge that is aggregated up in a centralized system in any kind of meaningful way. Okay, so when prices are communicating knowledge, sometimes the knowledge that they're communicating is contextual knowledge. It's tacit knowledge. It's knowledge that doesn't lend itself to central economic aggregation, certainly not by one mind. So the central economic problem that here Hayek's pointing out is not just of mobilizing physical resources, okay, to get them to the right place or to do the right thing, but also of getting minds to coordinate and to have reasonable agreement and expectations that coalesce over time. And so this is going to play a central role in some of Hayek's other arguments about how it is that prices provide a means for intertemporal coordination of resources, something that's fundamental for how economies grow and function over time. So Hayek develops this idea and presents this as really a fundamental challenge to the central planning mentality. And his central argument is basically this. How, in the absence of private property rights, prices, profit and loss, are producers going to be able to know what to produce and how to produce it? Okay, in what qualities, in what quantities, about who needs what, when, where. And this is kind of the argument that he begins to advance. So if you have the opportunity to read one and only one essay by Hayek, I have two choices. The first is probably this article, his 1945 piece, The Use of Knowledge in Society. It makes this point in a very profound and deep way. And it makes this point vis-a-vis the central planning mentality. This notion that what the problem that economics is trying to solve is not one of a set of equations with given data and given assumptions, but rather how it is that prices are able to kind of solve these computational challenges repeatedly over time and in real-time space. So his AER piece is a fundamental contribution to how it is that we understand the coordinating role of prices. And it lays out this idea of market process, that the principles of optimality, when we calculate how it is that markets allocate resources under competitive conditions, that those are an outcome of a competitive process, not the product of some kind of formal mathematical rules that can be kind of computationally understood ex ante. So property rights are necessary to generate these conditions, and prices act as a guide to future entrepreneurial activity. And so how does this relate back to planning? Well, leading up to World War II, there was, like I said, there was this great intellectual support for widespread economic planning and government control. And Hayek's skepticism of planning and the warnings against the political dangers associated with economic planning weren't really heeded, okay? They weren't particularly popular. So Hayek does take the opportunity to try to popularize these ideas. I won't read all of this, but in the kind of lead up to the publication of The Road to Serfdom, his popular tract where he tries to make this case, he writes to Walter Lippmann, he says, "I wish I could make my progressive friends understand that democracy is possible only under capitalism, and that collectivist experiments inevitably lead to fascism of one sort or another." So he's compelled to write this. He's writing to his friend Walter Lippmann about some of the ideas that will give rise to this book. And he's reacting to what's very much kind of the standard opinion of the day. Okay, this idea that central direction of resources, okay, central economic planning, actually provides the middle way between fascism and communism. Okay, so this was a very popular position at the time, and it's a position that Hayek specifically tries to take up when he writes The Road to Serfdom. So according to Lewis, he says, Hayek's intended target was the then fashionable view that socialist economic planning constituted this middle way between fascism and communism, which would preserve individual freedom while at the same time overcoming the deficiencies of the free market system. And I think this very much kind of captures Keynes's own view about what he thought the potential for coordinated central planning could actually achieve. So Hayek publishes The Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom is a tract that he dedicates to the socialists of all parties. And it's a book that basically argues that the logic of socialist economic planning will basically lead to an erosion of personal freedoms. And it's an erosion that is not inevitable. It's not an argument that we take one step down the road of government intervention and we're going to immediately turn into an authoritarian state, but it's a much more sophisticated argument about the dynamics of intervention, about how it is that when you try to centrally plan an entire economy, what you have to do is reduce the aims and direction of what people want to do to kind of a singular plan. And when you do that, you're going to create central types of problems that have to confront this dynamics of intervention. Okay, so he says the trouble with partial planning is precisely that every step forces us to further steps if the remaining free forces are not to upset our plans. So if it's the case that we have an intervention that begets more interventions, it's going to kind of lead to political pressures for consolidation of power. And so it's under this argument that Hayek often, he makes the argument in Road to Serfdom, that the tendency to want to control economies from the top down will also lead to a political consolidation in which you get the least scrupulous political actors rising to the top in such a system. Okay, so there's a danger as you go for more and more centralization of economic activity, you're going to get a reduction in personal liberty. And what I think is the more sophisticated argument that Hayek puts forward here is to show how the socialist demands, or the socialist ideas, actually change the demands for democratic institutions. Okay? Democratic institutions, and Hayek will come to elaborate on this later in some of his political philosophy work, is about how it is that when democratic institutions can delimit power, they can perform certain functions, but only if they perform certain functions. Okay? When you start to have demands on a democratic system that the democratic system cannot deliver on, it puts pressure on those democratic institutions to transform, okay, in order to try to meet those demands. And so Hayek very much says in the book, he's like, is there a greater tragedy imaginable than in our endeavor to consciously shape our future in accordance with high ideals that we should in fact unwittingly produce the very opposite of what we've been striving for? So this quote from Hayek captures his view in the sense that he's suggesting that the socialists of all stripes don't necessarily have bad intentions in terms of pursuing, in fact, they have often the best intentions in terms of pursuing this way of organizing economic activity. But in fact, they're not going to be able to realize the goals that they even set for themselves. And so he tries to make this case that this is just the wrong direction for the future of liberal societies. Okay. Well, Keynes responds, and this is where it gets a little interesting. Okay, so I'm one of these nerds and I like to dig into the archives. I don't know, can you see this, the print on here? Okay, so this is from the archives at the Hoover Institution, and we can actually read Keynes's response to Hayek's Road to Serfdom. And he starts off, he says, look, in my opinion, it's a grand book. Morally and philosophically, I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it. And not only in agreement with it, but deeply moved agreement. Keynes? Really? Tell me more. But, and here's the big but, the line of argument you take depends on the very doubtful assumption that planning is not more efficient. Quite likely, from the purely economic point of view, it is efficient. Okay, so Keynes goes on to make the argument that, in fact, no, planning can be even more efficient than the decentralized and anarchic, chaotic way of market prices. No, in fact, what we need is actually more planning. And so he makes that argument. And he says, no, what we need is the restoration of right moral thinking, a return to proper moral values in our social philosophy. And if only you could turn your crusade in the direction, you would not look or feel quite so much like Don Quixote. Okay, so he's saying, look, you're tilting at windmills with these arguments. You're not actually appealing to the needs and demands of today. You're not recognizing that wartime planning can actually be efficient in non-war contexts, and we can actually achieve much more if we go in the direction against what you're pointing to, Hayek. And he goes on to articulate it even more. He says, look, Hayek, dangerous acts can be done safely in a community which thinks and feels rightly, which would be the way to hell if it were executed by those who think and feel wrongly. So it's very much embodied this view that, look, as long as we've got the right people in charge, as long as they're at the helm and they know what to do, the elites can be able to direct the economy in ways that can overcome these inefficiencies of markets, that can actually produce a world where central economic planning is more efficient than the alternative. And so this is the challenge that Hayek has to take up. Now, unfortunately, for Keynes, Keynes passes away in 1946. So he's not going to live to see to what comes of these ideas in the second half of the 20th century. Now, Hayek goes on to write several other lectures, and so, like I said, if I had two pieces that I could recommend to you as your introductory foray into reading Hayek, it would either be The Use of Knowledge in Society, which I think is one of the most profound pieces in his technical economics, or the first essay in Individualism in Economic Order. It's a compilation of many of his essays. It's called Individualism, True and False. And this is a piece that I think it's both profound, But it's also emblematic of a lot of Hayek's thought in the sense that Hayek took seriously these ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment. And what he tries to do in this piece, which is indicative of a bigger project that he has in terms of the abuse of reason, is to try to sketch out how it is that rationalism, in terms of kind of this deep, deep commitment towards being able to rationally construct the world in the ways in which you see it, can deliver really disastrous results. And he writes this piece in 1945, and I can't help but think it's very much, this is totally speculative on my part, but I can't help but think it's in part inspired by Keynes's response to his Road to Serfdom. Because he's seeing very much in Keynes this kernel of a deep-seated commitment to and hubris in the ability to be able to rationally construct and direct society according to one's own view. And so Hayek's political and economic liberalism is an argument, is a set of ideas that he continues to develop throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, all the way up until the 80s. And he basically argued that if you're going to, desire to fully control and direct the economy also will necessarily entail directing all kinds of aspects of life. And so economic decisions, while we think of them as kind of operating in a separate realm from kind of social or political, are actually not that separate from our individual values and our individual purposes. And in fact, our economic decisions often reflect those purposes. And so Hayek advances this idea that in competitive markets, where you have price signals that indicate the relative values placed on various different goods, and you have the ability to trade and for resources to flow to their most highest valued uses, people with very different values can live together peacefully. And so much of his political philosophy that Hayek will continue to articulate over the course of the next kind of stages of his career, with the Constitution of Liberty, with law, legislation, and liberty, with the books that he kind of directs towards more political tracks, I argue, are very much aimed at trying to articulate what the types of rules that are necessary in order for people with very different values to be able to live together peacefully. Okay, so he does this in a number of places. I won't be able to say much about it now, but central to this notion for Hayek is the generality principle about how it is that rules can apply generally to the entire population in which they're governed, and how the rule of law is actually central to this notion. So in contrast to arbitrary rule of men over men, Hayek advances the position that the rule of law can stand as something that's opposed to discretionary rule. Okay, this idea that everyone is subject to the rules of society. And so he contrasts this rule by arbitrary government with the rule of law. And basically he says, look, when you strip it of all its garb, what it means is that everyone is going to, everyone, including the government, their actions are going to be bound by rules that are fixed, that are announced beforehand, and are generally applicable, and which make possible the ability to foresee with pretty fair certainty how authority is going to be able to wield coercive powers in given circumstances, such that individuals can actually plan and base their affairs on this knowledge. So Hayek makes the argument that we need the rule of law and the stability of these rules in order for people to be able to carry out and conduct their business with any kind of level of certainty. And so he makes the case for why it is that the stability and generality of rules creates the conditions under which societies can flourish. And societies can flourish with people who have values that are very different from one another, which I think is incredibly important. And so in later arguments, Hayek's going to make the case that central economic planning itself is actually incompatible with the rule of law. okay? That central economic planning requires this discretionary use of coercion in ways that are not just detrimental to economic and individual liberty, but detrimental to growth and a flourishing economy as well. And so while Keynes and Hayek both kind of start out at the beginning of the 20th century having some kind of shared vision of liberalism, by the mid-20th century, they very much end up in different places. Keynes has his liberalism has drifted into kind of a progressive elitism, whereas Hayek kind of retains some of these kind of kernels of his 18th century Enlightenment inspiration and kind of a classical liberal perspective. So embracing a decentralized market competition model as opposed to centralized economic planning, trying to articulate the principles under which spontaneous order can actually outperform central economic planning, and how a spontaneous order within a set of general and equally applicable rules can produce a prosperous society. We didn't talk so much about this, but it's implicit in some of the arguments I've put forward with Keynes, is that Keynes actually did not have very much confidence in the individual ability of agents to, behave rationally within their economic environment. Whereas Hayek, although very far from kind of a standard rational agent neoclassical economist, he really did think that individuals, given their ability to respond to market signals and market prices, were fallible but capable, and that they were the types of rational agents that could accomplish their ends as they saw fit in a society in which you had clear and predictable rules. And so Bruce Caldwell wrote a fabulous book on an intellectual biography of Hayek. He actually has a new book out that's a proper biography of Hayek, but if I had to recommend one, I would recommend his book, Hayek's Challenge. And what he points out in that book is that Hayek's views were incredibly unpopular for most of his life. Certainly over the period that I've talked to you about today, in the first part of the 20th century, Hayek's views were out of sync with the rest of the intelligentsia. Okay, so the Sidneys and the Beatrice Webbs of the world were kind of the much more popular positions on these issues, and Hayek was very much seen as out of sync, and in fact, often seen, certainly after the publication of The Road to Serfdom, was seen as kind of taking a personal and intellectual hit for writing such a political tract. But Hayek actually turns his attention in 1947, after writing that book, after the death of Keynes, to kind of looking out on the mess of the Western world after World War II and trying to do something about it. And he organized the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, bringing together a group of like-minded scholars, and there were only a handful who kind of believed in the principles of a well-ordered market economy as being a vehicle for supporting and advancing liberalism throughout the world. And so he started the Mont Pelerin Society, and there's very interesting things that we can say about the Mont Pelerin Society. But it included thinkers like Frank Knight, Karl Popper, Ludwig von Mises was there, but also Milton Friedman and George Stigler. And it was a society that was not aimed at political influence, but rather a society that was to cultivate how we might develop and advance these ideas such that they can be influential and continue to bear fruit going forward. So while Hayek was very much out of sync with the professional intelligentsia for much of his life, He does get vindicated. He gets vindicated on the 60th anniversary of the Road to Serfdom. At least this is one opinion by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. He says, look, Hayek's critique of state planning, particularly concerned with the way that centralized state planning and the huge asymmetry of power that tends to accompany it, may generate a psychology of indifference to individual liberty. As Hayek put it, I have never accused the socialist parties of deliberately aiming at a totalitarian regime. He says we can hardly ignore the massive accumulation of evidence before and after the publication of The Road to Serfdom of the tyrannical use of bureaucratic power and privilege and the political and economic corruption that tends to go with it. So while Hayek's ideas were unpopular in his own day, they have had some vindication. There's other cases in which we can look. There's a lot of very famous Sovietologists who, after the fall of the Soviet Union, came to actually praise the arguments that Mises and Hayek put forward so early in arguing against the inability to engage in rational economic calculation under socialism. So with that, I will conclude. If you're interested in reading more about Hayek, like I said, I very much recommend this intellectual biography by Bruce Caldwell. I think it's one of the best treatments, both of Hayek's technical contributions to economics, but also in situating it within the broader kind of intellectual development. Thank you. I look forward to talking with you more about any and all of this.
Question.
Yeah.
How do you think the fact that the 20s were very influenced by colonialism mindset operated in these two great thinkers? Like, where they took colonialism as a mindset? It's apparent that every one of them took it to a different direction, but this was the present. It was highly colonialist.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, this is a big divide between Keynes and Hayek. Keynes saw colonialism often, in many cases in some of his writings, as a benevolent force for extending and bringing the institutions of Britain to other parts of the world. Hayek was much more skeptical. He was much more skeptical, and in fact, this is one of the ideas that comes out in Mises's Nation, State, and Economy that he writes in 1919 in response to the Treaty of Versailles, in which what Mises's argument there is for political self-determination and for democracy. He's an early proponent of liberal democracy and democratic institutions, but such that they are given the opportunity for self-identified groups to engage in political self-determination. And so this is an idea that I think Hayek takes very much from Mises and puts him in very stark contrast with Keynes on this view. For Mises, also in Nation, State, and Economy, it's incredibly important for his view of how it is that the Western world can go forward, that that political self-determination is coupled with liberal democracy, but also with free trade. Because for him, you can have smaller political units of self-determination so long as they can engage in broader kind of institutions of free trade. And so that's actually really important for him. Where Keynes also saw the benefit of trade, but was much more optimistic, about the ability of colonialism to be able to impart institutions to other parts of the world.
It seems like from what you described, like he describes the collapse of globalization, but it wasn't really globalization. It was a certain type of globalization where they control the narrative and they have like branches of themselves all around, and this was the global effect.
It was very much, Keynes very much saw everything from, a British-centric point, elite British-centric point of view. Absolutely. And that's, very much comes out in all of his perspectives on these things. So I think you're putting your finger on it.
What do you think Hayek would say about social bonds, if you're familiar with the concept?
Social bonds. Tell me more. What do you mean?
Social bonds are bonds issued by governments as like a success factor in impact or philanthropy activities. Like they issue a bond, which if you as an entrepreneur succeed on giving the right impact, like the promised impact around a certain criteria, then the government will pay you back the money. Like instead of me like wanting to raise, I want to have better employment rates in the Negev, let's say, okay? And I have an idea on how to do it. I'm an entrepreneur and I will do it. Okay, let me do it, move aside. Government move aside. And then if I succeed, the government reimburses me for the money I spent. And this is how I can re-spend my money elsewhere. And it's not like just given away. The government has lower risk because it doesn't need to figure out if I'm right or wrong. And I'm willing to take the risk because I want to have, like, operate my virtues and that, but I want to keep my money working again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how Hayek would respond to that, but I'll say two things. The first is that one of the things that I hope we get into in discussion and talk more about is that one of the, Keynes was very much a proponent of the socialization of investment. And so he had a lot of views about how it is that the government should play a role in directing investment, both in times of when things are bad, but also in times when things are good. Whereas Hayek, gradually moved farther and farther away from this position that government should have any kind of role in the financial system, in particular, even in the issuance of currency. So earlier in his life, Hayek advocated, acknowledged that government might have a role in providing, a monetary currency within, a particular economy. But as he, developed in his own thought, he moved farther and farther away from that idea, particularly because in Hayek's view of the trade cycle, one of the kind of the main components that generates the boom and bust cycle is the manipulation of credit on the part of the state. And so Hayek, originally thinks, okay, well, maybe we can kind of limit the ability of the state to engage in these credit fluctuations by making them adhere to some general rules about monetary policy. Well, it turns out the state's not very good at abiding by general rules. And so he moves farther and farther away from that. So I doubt that he would be very enthusiastic, at least towards the later part of his life, about any kind of government subsidization of those kind of social bonds and social investment. That said, the other side of Hayek's thought is that, he's very much of this notion that there's an entire scope of economic activity that lies outside of markets and the state. Civil society plays a really important role in accomplishing particular social ends that are not political and they're not economic. And so while I don't think he would support any kind of government subsidization or bond issuance in order to achieve those ends, I think he's very much of he wanted to call the Mount Pelerin Society the Tocqueville-Acton Society. And the Tocqueville component of that was very much in recognition that Tocqueville saw this role for civil society, civil associations in kind of playing a mediating factor between markets and the state. So that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but that's what I got for you. Yeah.
So you described Hayek and Keynes as two intellectual giants debating subjects that were critical for their area, for their era. What would you say is the modern equivalent debate in economics?
Oh man. See, I'm a historian of economic thought, so I spend all my time thinking about the past. Shoot, on the spot. I mean, I think I'm thinking about a lot of different debates. In terms of, the geopolitical debates, Brexit was a huge, discussion around kind of whether or not that was going to be something that was economically viable. In terms of macroeconomic stability, I think all of the arguments that are going on right now about the stimulus policies, about the spending in post-COVID world, I think these fit directly into the kind of same debates that were going on between Hayek and Keynes over how it is that we should generate the conditions for prosperity. I mean, Keynes was very much a proponent of kind of government spending in order to kind of boost the economy, to stimulate the economy. And many of Hayek's arguments point out the folly of doing just that. So all of the, so much of the inflation that we're experiencing, at least in the US right now, is a direct result of much of the monetary policy that's been pursued over the lead up till now. So I see that those are really critical debates that have seeds both in kind of Hayek and Keynes's arguments. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
What do you think about combining those two thoughts, those two ideas, in which circumstances that fit into this side? One time to use Keynes' idea when it's necessary, and one time use the Hayek idea when you want, growth, more independency, and you don't have to pick one of the side. You can combine them. What do you think about that idea?
So I think that's an alluring option. I think that that's what a lot of people who wanted to try to pursue this middle way see. And I think Hayek's argument on this is that they're fundamentally incompatible at the level of central economic planning. The idea that you can engage in some planning and not a lot. This is part of the argument that he tries to articulate in The Road to Serfdom, is that once you start asking institutions to do things that they cannot do, you're going to get into a situation in which intervention begets more intervention. Okay? And so I think Hayek would suggest that that's a fundamental incompatibility. That said, later in much of his work, he tries to make this distinction between organizations and orders. This idea that when we're talking about kind of when we're talking about the types of rules that are conducive to a large-scale open access order, what we're talking about are these kind of abstract principles by which systems can engage in self-ordering. So these are the types of rules that are often evolutionary in nature. They take a long time to develop. These are the types of institutions that provide kind of the stability for markets to operate. These are orders. And within orders, you can have all kinds of organizations, right? You can have firms, you can have local institutions, you can have civil society, you can have smaller, political units. And in organizations, you can have people whose ideas are very important, that are instrumental in directing those organizations. But he makes a categorical distinction never to confuse the two, in that the principles that govern organizations are actually not appropriate for governing large order systems. And so I think he would suggest that that's a very alluring idea. It's tempted many people in the past, and it fundamentally will lead to an incongruence between the ability to actually execute that. So part of his argument is that even though people may want to be able to apply those principles to kind of the large extended order, that fundamentally it's not going to work out.
But what about helping the needy, when there is a crash or something and people will have to go to the streets, I don't know. The free market won't always be fast or have enough incentives to help them. So you can combine the ideas under certain circumstances, which is, I don't know, when there is a crash, a war or something, you can use Keynes' idea to help the needy, to help the indigent. And when there is prosperity and you want to grow, you can, you know what I mean?
So I encourage you to hold on to that idea. Because we're going to hear from some speakers that are going to talk about some public interest and some public choice concerns that might shed some light on that. But I'll also say that for Hayek and for kind of addressing those types of problems, it's always a question of kind of a comparative institutional claim about what types of institutions can actually respond to those things in ways that perform better. And I would argue it's not always so obvious that the state response is actually going to be the better response. It's a very short answer to a very difficult problem. But also, Hayek himself, at least earlier, Hayek was not, an anarchist. Like he supported a minimal welfare state in terms of being able to supply for kind of a minimal well-being. So there's some interesting kind of ways in which he tries to square that. And the short answer is he tries to do it in such a way that the rules that apply to supplying that minimal social safety net are the rules that are general and applicable to all, that aren't about picking winners or losers. Because as soon as you're in the business of picking winners and losers, you're in kind of a dynamics of intervention circumstance that he's very skeptical is going to turn out well.
One last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.